So, hello everyone. I'm Jonathan Dickstein, Assistant Professor of Jain and Vegan Studies at Arihanta Institute, and I'm really excited to invite you to this event in our 2026 Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series. So, our speaker series, this is the second iteration. 2 years ago, we ran the first series, and the series that this year's over 9 events really has a twofold focus. And the first focus is to bring influential work in vegan studies into conversation with the Jain community and also scholars of Jainism. And the second focus is to introduce broader audiences to the ways Jain philosophy and practice meaningfully connect with contemporary veganism. At Arihanta Institute, we understand vegan studies as an interdisciplinary field that brings together animal studies, food studies, race studies, gender studies, environmental studies, and other related areas of inquiry. So, for our second talk, we welcome Emilia Leese, who will present today on letting nature lead, lessons for our ecosystems and our lives. Emilia Leese is an author, rewilder, and podcast host, exploring the intersections of ethics, food, and our relationship with the natural world. After a 20-year career as a corporate finance lawyer, she now channels her strategic insight into vegan advocacy and ecological restoration. She is the co-author of Think Like a Vegan and co-hosts the podcast of the same name. She edits a magazine and splits her time between London and the Scottish Highlands. You can find Emilia's work at emilialeese.com and the award-winning birchfieldhighlands.org. And I'll drop these links in the chat for everyone. So thank you so much, Emilia, for being here. It's really a wonderful opportunity for us.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for inviting me and to the Arihanta Institute for hosting this. This is a great series.
Great.
And I am honored to be on the roster with such amazing people.
Thank you so much. And I love how you contribute to this discussion because we really try to bring together people, not just academics, but also activists, also scientists, organizers, and so on, and more, say, popular authors, so we could say. So I'm really happy to have you here. And I want to tell everyone before I turn things over to Emilia that the Q&A is available throughout this talk. So please, you don't really have to wait till the end. If something comes up in the middle and you want to ask a question, drop it in the Q&A. I'll organize those and pepper Emilia with those once we get finished with the talk. So if you'd like to share slides, we can get started.
I would like to share slides, so just give me a moment to do all that jazz. And here we go. Hopefully this works. Let me go from the start. And here we are. Okay, so this picture here is a rare photo of Scotland in the sunshine and of Birchfield. It looks a little bit grayer usually, but here we have a very sunny picture. My name is Emilia, as you've heard. This is Think Like a Vegan podcast, book, and I do a bunch of other things. I write for a number of other publications. And one of the big things that's involved in my life is rewilding at Birchfield. The agenda for today is that I want to talk about rewilding and I want to talk about nature restoration and biodiversity, but I need to give you a little bit of background. I'm going to assume a little bit of knowledge on your part. So I will go through the first 3 points relatively quickly so I can spend more time talking about the project. But I think that the background is also very important. So biodiversity loss, because biodiversity is central. Biodiversity loss as an existential threat. Then talk about land use. What is ecosystem rewilding? What we're doing at Birchfield, and what lessons, which will be a thread woven throughout this talk. So, guess what? Amazingly, biodiversity loss impacts national security. This little screenshot here is from a report that the UK government put out, and that says nature is a foundation of national security. I'm on the one hand, I think it's funny because I have a tragic comedy streak. That is like, yes, nature is pretty much important, just like one's home is important to not be set on fire while you're in it. But it's good for the government to recognize such importance because maybe we can move forward the conversation about how we don't set our house on fire. Biodiversity is nature, is everything, including us and what we do, and it includes insects and birds and plant life, everything. And what affects biodiversity is us and how we have a lot of things affect biodiversity. There can be sort of natural, it could be, the meteorite, and then that changes everything. But it's also at this point, it's us and how we have been using land. Um, the primary thing that has changed biodiversity and has changed a lot of our all of our environments is how we use land for particularly animal agriculture. So 50% of habitable land is used for agriculture, and 77% of that portion is for livestock, meat, and dairy. Not just for, and when I say livestock, I'm using quotes. That's not necessarily a term I like, but that's the term that is used. Um, and it's not just for the animals themselves, but it's also for the agricultural products that are grown to feed them. Now, livestock, meat and dairy, eggs, and all of that only provides globally 18% of our calories. So we're using all of that land to produce only 18% of our calories, which we could replace with other uh, plant products. And then we have 37% of habitable land that is now forest. Forests and a variety of different environments are key for biodiversity. But what those numbers are all big, but what does it actually look like? And I found this incredible graph here, or pictograph from Our World in Data, that shows us how much land in practice we're actually using for animal agriculture. And it's the entirety of the American continent, from the very top to the very bottom. Um, and I found that to be quite astonishing. And how does that then translate into different countries? So for the U.S., land use has a very similar. It's got a very similar profile. Land use, it's primarily for animal agriculture. So you have 665 million acres of land used for pasture. And then you have the portion, the 391.5 million acres that are used for crops. Of that, only 77.3 million acres are used for human food consumption. So again, this balance of what we are using for animal agriculture has a direct impact on deforestation, on water runoff, contamination, and so forth, which has a significant impact on biodiversity, and which in turn has a significant impact on us. And hold on one second. Here we go. And in the UK, it's a very similar thing. So you can extrapolate from this, and in many countries, this sort of disbalance continues. In the UK, and I'm going to talk a bit more about the UK because we're going to talk about Scotland. This map here again shows you how the land is divided up in terms of use, not in terms of location. So you have mostly it's for animal agriculture, whether it's dairy, whether it's meat production. So going from the general to the specific, which again can be extrapolated a little bit everywhere, generally, what happened to the forest in Scotland? What has affected biodiversity so much? So you have early agriculture. About 10 to 11,000 years ago, although it's a little bit less in Scotland because Scotland was had an ice age that changed a little bit later, but still, um, about 10 to 11,000 years ago, you have early agriculture. You have the agricultural revolution. You start when people stopped being nomadic and started settling and started keeping animals. So what? How you say, well, and well, they had to cut the forests down in order to keep those animals. So you might say, I don't know, you might say, well, Emmy, you have small farms. Small farms are fine. Everybody knows that, right? Well, do we? Um, I want you to, I'm going to ask you a question and either put it in the chat in a Q&A or just think about it real quick, but it has to be sort of a instinctive thing. At what point do you think at what point in history, do you think that we started to see a bite on the forests disappearing? Do you think it was, in the last couple of centuries? Do you think it was, what was it? Because in 3, 2, 1, I'm going to tell you for at least for Scotland. In Scotland, well, at least for Britain, I should say, correct myself. In Britain, by the time the Romans arrived, which was in 52 CE, so a little bit less than 2,000 years ago, by 52 CE, already 50% of the forests in Britain were gone. And that was really because of agriculture. Thereafter, things start picking up. You have empire building and colonialism. Why does that matter, you say? Well, colonialism happens outward and inward. So from inward, the ship building, the fuel and the leather tanning and all of that was required. You have to build the ships. So what do? You first use all of the wood that you have in England, and then you travel upwards and you take all of the wood in Scotland as well. Then in the 1750s, you have the clearances, which is a historical moment in Scotland, which I will talk about in the next slide. But that's the 1750s, and that had a big impact. Then you have the development of large shooting estates, again, into 1800s, 1900s. And then you have the development of commercial forestry. And by the 19th century, we only have about 5% of woodland cover. Now I want you to go and look at the actual photograph. That's the background there. That's from Scotland. And so some of you may have been to Scotland or may have read about it and so on, seen pictures, and you see these sort of big moorlands with no trees, and it evokes all sorts of romantic ideas, and I don't know. But then I want you to compare that. You think, okay, Scotland's always been like that, right? Then I want you to look at the bottom there, at the bottom of that photograph where you see the river and you see some of the trees. And especially in between, on the left-hand side of the photograph, you see the two hills sort of joining, coming down, and then there's trees. That's what remains of what the woodland would have looked like in Scotland throughout the ages. You would have had a patchwork of different types of forests, and you see the last remnants of it, or of what the rest of those moorlands would have looked like in those areas where agriculture and sheep farming and sheep grazing wouldn't have been possible because they're either too steep or too close to the water and so forth. So you have this evidence and you have this landscape that shows you how two very different historical ways of being for this environment. So I want you to keep that in mind. We've got to talk about sheep because Britain is kind of known for sheep, and they're kind of everywhere. Sheep were a wild animal, and they were brought into being domesticated about 6,000 BCE. Then in 4,000 BCE, the Neolithic peoples who moved to Britain from continental Europe, they brought the sheep along with them. Then the Romans brought more sheep. And in fact, from my research, they were some of the first people in Britain to have industrial sized type farming. They had tens of thousands of sheep. Then you have the clearances in 1750s, in particularly in the Highlands. There were Scottish owners of large estates. They were evicting their tenant farmers from the land very unkindly. This was not a good thing, and there was lots of suffering in this process. They evicted their tenant farmers from the land because they wanted to put more sheep on the land to emulate what was happening for the big landowners in Spain who had done a similar thing, and they were reaping very high profits from cultivating sheep and rearing sheep. And today we have 31 million sheep in Britain. They roam on hills and in plains, and they forage, and that has an impact on biodiversity, obviously, because the land can't regenerate, the trees can't regenerate, the variety of species of plants can't regenerate, and then you also have the knock-on effects on other species of animals and plants. You might or might not be familiar with the deer, so-called deer problem in Scotland, where the issue, people say, oh, well, there are too many deer in Scotland, and that's why we can't have forests. We have too many deer. So it bears a little bit of background information about the deer. There are two native species, the red and the roe deer. Excuse me. Then you have the fallow deer that were introduced in the 11th century by the Normans. And again, people call non-native deer non-native species, introduced species, and all of this. But frankly, if you've been around in one place since the 11th century, you're native. You just in a different space, but you've been there a long time. And then you have the sika deer. Sika actually means deer in Japanese, which gives you a hint of where these deer came from. They were introduced in the 19th century. And all of these introduced species were introduced for ornamental reasons. People liked them. They thought they were cute. They wanted them in their gardens and their estates, and also to shoot them. So again, how we have affected our environment without learning that by doing that, we're actually affecting the environment and the various species and also ourselves. It's a common theme from a very long time. But people talk about the deer being a problem, but really, if you compare the numbers, there are 2 million deer in Britain and there are 31 million sheep in Britain. People tend to not talk about the sheep as an issue, but they talk about the deer only as an issue because there are vested interests in keeping the shooting industry going and so on. So how agriculture plays a role in how we even understand nature. We problematize one set and we tend to ignore the other. That is changing and has changed quite a bit in terms of discourse, even over the last few years. So, rewilding. Rewilding basically is an effort to scientifically attempt to restore biodiversity. It's a science-based process, and to restore the natural processes and the agency of nature and all of the biodiversity that it encompasses. The long-term goal of rewilding is to reduce human intervention. But in the meanwhile, there is some human intervention. And I'll explain quickly what that is so that we can get a fuller understanding of that. What rewilding actively does is it's a variety of different things. We look at connectivity because we know islands of biodiversity tend to just, well, they're islands, they are isolated. So you want biodiversity, you want nature to be connected so that you create corridors, you create wildlife crossings, and you link ecosystems to benefit all of the ecosystems in that area. Rewilding also enables trophic restoration. You might be familiar with that term from the wolves in the Yellowstone Park in the U.S. And there is an element of reintroducing keystone species, which has its own whole ethical issues along with it, which we won't get into now, but we can discuss later. So you have beavers, for example, for Scotland, and you have wood ants, which I'll talk about later, which we have reintroduced. And they're ecological engineers. So you can have ecological engineers like wolves, and they're all charismatic species, wolves and beavers and bears and so forth. But you can also have really small ants are really actually extremely important. And in rewilding, you assist the natural regeneration. So you have strategic planting of trees and plants and so forth, managing introduced species. Again, that's a whole separate discussion. And reintroducing natural disturbances like fire. Fire is a natural process which we have suppressed and or use for different purposes, but those purposes aren't to benefit the biodiversity of the space, but they are often to benefit, whether we do it or we suppress it, to benefit the humans behind it, without any regard to biodiversity and what it does. So fundamentally, it's a paradigm shift that rewilding is asking of you. It moves us from seeing nature as a resource for human benefits to recognizing the intrinsic value and agency of all species and processes. So a wolf and a beaver, they're not just creating their spaces, they're shaping their world. But it goes also for non-humans and rather non-animals. A river, for example, has the right to meander instead of being a straight flow of water, which is what we tend to do with the rivers when we can. They have a right to meander because that is their natural state. And the process itself, uh, there's a variety of different pieces. And because you're trying to do it in a scientific way, you're using both different elements to guide you. And also with just very practical things like you have an initial intervention, like you're restoring a forest or you're going to plant some trees that you may not have on site. Like we don't have on site certain types of trees, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. And then you say, okay, well, at this point, I should step back and let the other trees and the other plants regenerate on their own if they can. You keep an eye on it, but ultimately the goal is to have a self-sustaining and resilient ecosystem. Of course, this paradigm shift should then be incorporated into everything that makes up a culture. So you have policy, you have economy, and you have actual human culture. And related to all this are 10 principles set out, and I won't go into each one. They're set out by the IUCN, which is the world's preeminent nature conservation organization body with multidisciplinary facets. And essentially, it's basically looking at nature, but incorporating everything into nature. We're not separate from it. And species are not just species, they're made up of individuals and so on. So you try to do it scientifically, but with a certain kind of ethos. And on that note, when I drafted this presentation, Mark Beekoff hadn't yet published this particular piece in Psychology Today. But there's a quote that's, I think, is quite relevant and spoke to me anyway. It says, rewilding demands humility in how we interact with other animals and the places they call home. We need to be humble in the face of what the Romantic poets of the late 18th century referred to as nature's sublimity, its awesomeness. We should treat nature as we would a dear friend, whose welfare matters for its own sake, and even more so because it matters for our sake too. So to me, that really is the crux of rewilding. So getting down to the specifics of Birchfield and our project. This is a nice little map drawn for us by a good friend of ours in Scotland. And Birchfield is a 100-acre former commercial forest just south of Loch Ness. And we bought it in 2017. My partner and I bought it in 2017 after a couple of years following uh, a talk that we listened to from Alan Watson Featherstone, who is essentially the godfather of rewilding in the UK, if not even Europe, and if not even also further than that. But anyway, so we heard a talk given by Alan Watson Featherstone, who founded Trees for Life, which is a rewilding and reforesting charity. And my partner turns to me and says, "Why don't we do something like that?" I thought that was a very interesting statement. I said, "Well, okay." He's like, "Yeah, well, we could buy some land and plant some trees." I said, "Okay, let's go for it." Um, so our idea was to plant trees. Okay, that's where we started. And this now, these three sort of objectives are our general aims. So we restore the forest, the peat bog, and the funga, reintroduce locally extinct species, and inspire people to connect with the environment. Of course, harking back to the previous discussion about land use, we do ask everybody who stays on site and who comes in and works with us to only consume plant-based foods. And we've never had an issue with that. So when we bought the land, we were like, oh, let's just plant some trees. Well, but then we started working with some people. I'll introduce you in a second. And we came up with a number of different things that they wanted to do, that we wanted to do, and we all collaborate together to make them happen. Um, the techie type stuff that we do is we use different approaches. So we're using audio mops, and I'll explain to you what that is. We use drones, we use virtual reality, we use AI with respect to bird identification, which we couldn't do with just humans, and remote sensing technologies. We've also developed a framework for natural capital accounting that's a bit different from how natural capital accounting is generally framed. Basically, natural capital accounting takes into account more than just the cost of planting the tree and what you can then get from selling it, for example. It looks at trees with their own inherent value, not just trees, but all of nature and different things, with each has its own value and the value of all of the various things, like whether it's carbon absorption, oxygen generation, the welfare and well-being of people who interact with those spaces, all of that. Yes, it's given a monetary value, but we already give nature a monetary value. We just tend to make it as to, income, outgoings, and profit that you can take from it. This kind of sets things up more. It gives more of a perspective for people who need that kind of thing. I might not need that. You might not need that, but there are some people who look at the world like that. And then we, sort of do cool communications type stuff with VR and digital platforms. All this, all these various things got started because after we bought it, we said to some people that we had been working with, like, hey, look, we are going to plant some trees on this 100 acres. Do you think we could do something a little bit more interesting? So we had somebody from ACOM who said, yes, I want to create a new way of sharing natural capital accounting. Then Lifescape Project, another conservation NGO, got involved, University of Cumbria, Nottingham Trent University, and so on. We did a lot of different things with people who got involved and said, I have this idea and I'd like to test it out. So what we said was, wow, yes, that sounds great, amazing, let's do it. And instead of having this idea that we had to be fixed on planting trees only, We said, and again, I'm reminded of the Beekoff's quote. We said, well, fantastic. We need, more heads in this, and we need more thinking, and we're happy to try different things. And so one of the first things that we did do was to conduct a baseline survey. ACOM conducted that with Nature Metrics and some other people, a baseline survey of who lives in this forest, what lives there, and so that we could understand what was actually happening. And we also had a mycology survey done to understand what kind of mycorrhizal networks were on site, because as we know now, lots of fungi are so important to soil health and to biodiversity. It's extremely important. Then we were so fortunate to get to work with Alan Watson Featherstone himself, who provided a missing species report. Essentially, um, what species, if this were a fully functioning ecosystem, what species of plants, animals, everything, what would be there? And we use that as a guide for various projects and various even priorities of what we need to get done and so forth. So fun stuff, the virtual reality. That was really interesting and really fun because we get to see a version of what Birchfield will be like when we are no longer here hundreds of years in the future. And if everything goes well, obviously. That was super fun. ACOM did that. Uh, one of the interesting lessons that we learned through this idea of the audio moths and trail cams was something. It was really great. So Professor Ian Convery from the University of Cumbria said, "Oh, fantastic! I'll get my trail cams all ready, and we'll set it all up in a grid. We'll see who's there, who passes by. Fantastic." Then we have Professor Volker Dieck, also of University of Cumbria, who's a specialist in um, cetaceans, so whales and dolphins. He said, I've been using audio moths all my career underwater. I want to see what it's like if we put them on land. So now we have audio and visual. Fantastic. Well, after a few years and after a lot of recording, particularly of sound, because the recording happens sort of automatically at a certain intervals, we get this picture not just of the animals who walk, animals, birds, everybody who walk in front of the trail cam, but also who's around, who is flying through, who is resident in some areas, who is just passing by on a once or twice kind of thing, as and birds and bats, in fact. So you get much more of a 360 view of what is actually happening. And what's also really interesting about this, there are certain sections of Birchfield that are still the commercial forest. So you can see that a little bit in the picture on the right. The trees are very close together. And in some areas, they're even closer together. Whenever we walk through those areas are very quiet. And but you don't know why that is. But when you have the audio moths that's there 24/7, and then from the audio moth you learn that there are no birds there ever, you start to understand that it's not just your sense that the forest is silent, but it's actually silent. And you start to also develop a sense of how uh, we are not we're not even honoring the trees themselves. The Sitka spruce is the type of tree that grows commercially in Scotland, which are these Pacific Northwest of the US trees that grow immensely and are old and gigantic, but they're just these little sticks there. And so you feel bad for them. But you also know that this environment doesn't actually foster anyone else. So you're always dealing with this tension, and that's one of the lessons too, this tension of trying to fix something that may not be fixable or might be fixable in different ways, and you have to live with that and or at least come to terms with it. Fun thing, when ACOM did the baseline survey, they discovered that there was a peat bog. Very briefly, peat bogs are carbon sinks made up of compressed vegetation under a layer of water. And the compressed vegetation has been building up there for thousands of years. 1 meter of peat equals about 1,000 years. And they found places where we had a meter, 2 meters, and even 5 meters of peat, which means 5,000 years of compressed vegetation and all that carbon that was being stored in there. Peat bogs are like, I think, second to oceans, a huge carbon sink. And so we discovered that was there. And so we said, oh my gosh, we are so glad we never planted trees on that site. Because had we gone ahead and just planted trees without actually getting to know what was there, we could have created a bigger problem for ourselves and dried up the peat even more than it was already dry. And I can go into the reasons, but it's basically forestry, how you cut channels into the earth in order to drain water. But draining the water from a peat bog is quite lethal to the peat bog. So we're now restoring that. Uh, Hairy wood ant translocation. As I said, they're one of the keystone species in a forest. Ants do all sorts of things. They move debris. They aerate the earth. They control certain insects while promoting other insects, which are beneficial to the local space. All sorts of things. They're really, really quite fascinating. I could get into it, and I won't. Another rewilding project gave us a call and said, hey, we know you're interested in hairy wood ants. We have a section of our project that we are going to have to cut the trees to then plant the native species. And it goes through 3 wood ant nests. Would you like them? So Lifescape Project and Nottingham Trent University got together and said, we would love to do that. So we translocated these ants on site. Now, you're saying, well, okay, that's nice. What did you learn from that? Well, a few things. One of the things when you translocate ants, you feed them. You do a supplementary feeding for about a month, sometimes 2 weeks, but about a month. And basically, it's these sugar paste that you put around the nest so that they can get established. The summer that we had the translocation was very wet and awful. And lots of birds were suffering, lots of insects were suffering, all sorts of things like that. And we were on a call and we were talking about the ants, and the supplementary feeding schedule was coming to an end. And I said, you know, what happens if you continue the supplementary feeding? Does that affect them in a bad way? And so Nottingham Trent University professor said, no, it would be fine, but why are you thinking this? And I said, well, we have moved them from their place where they were established, irrespective of whether they were going to lose their lives there. But we have moved them, and we now owe them a duty of care while they establish themselves. This summer has been so terrible that they're going to have really an uphill challenge. So I said, can we feed them for longer? Yes, we can totally do that. And they had and no, I'm not making a judgment on anyone because we all deal with our internal biases, especially anthropocentrism and speciesism. We just don't realize it a lot of times. So being able to remove yourself from that and say, wait a second, I need to think about the ants themselves. So I know there's loads and loads of ants all over the world, but I'm responsible for these guys here because I've done something to change their lives. So we've started supplementary feeding until the first winter when they then go underground and then they reemerge in the spring. And that then turned out to be super interesting because we learned all sorts of things about ants that we didn't know before. Not just us, but even the scientists who are actually who know a lot more about ants and insects than certainly me myself and my partner do. So that was another lesson. We realized that there were osprey flying over our site, so we built an osprey nesting platform. No one has taken that up yet, but hopefully in the next year, maybe two, who knows? Hopefully they'll see it and they'll like it. And then one of the things, somewhat controversial, that we're doing, somewhat controversial because people just shoot the deer in on their land, partly because the Scottish government asks you to, and partly because that's just how things are done. We tried different things. We tried, there is one section of the land where there's a number of deer who are trapped in there because the previous owners fenced an area about 50 acres and they fenced the deer inside. So the deer didn't want to really leave. So we did a number of different things. We tried to drive them out so that they would go into the wilderness. You can kind of see in the right hand photograph that there's a lot of open space and open wilderness just connected with us. Um, and we tried to do that. That wasn't as very successful. But one of the other things that we have been doing is using this stuff called Trico, which is a spray that is made of rendered sheep fat. It is a non-vegan product, obviously, but it means that the deer uh, don't have to be killed. The trico acts as an unpleasant odor and unpleasant taste, so we spray it on the plants so that they don't eat them, and the little saplings that are just regenerating can just, you can see that in the second picture with my hand on it going like that. The sapling can grow into a tree, and the trees that are planted can grow higher than just at the very top of the tube when the deer just kind of give them a haircut. That's been very good. When we were first doing it, there weren't a lot of people doing it, but now it's gotten so many people are actually interested in it that saplings now come pre-treated with Trico, and big Scandinavian companies who grow trees, tree nurseries, and so forth. They use Trico instead of the traditional methods of killing them. So that's really good. But although people get upset with me because I'm using a non-vegan product, well, this is the tension of the world in which we live. Community engagement. People, according to the IUCN principles and according to my basic ethics, people are part of nature, and we all have to learn to coexist. And one of the important things is community engagement within our rewilding project. So we have artists in residence, we've had music composed on site, we've had a film filmed on site called The Lives of Our Confines, which you can find on YouTube. It's it's a horror film, but not gory, and it's one of the very few mostly Black British films made, certainly in horror genre. We have a forest interpretation hut and hide that we built ourselves. We've been on the BBC Country File, which is a big program about nature, generally about farms, but they had a profile on us, which was nice. And we've worked with local schools, with the children coming. We've had politicians coming to visit. We've had tourists now and again, and big groups like Rewilding Europe and the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management also came to visit. And the lessons that, wrapping it up, sort of. It's important to remember that biodiversity loss didn't start like in the 20th century. It started a long time ago. It has accelerated. Um, but it started a long time ago. So there are no quick fixes. And rewilding, like nature, isn't linear or binary. Lots of things can be true at once. Lots of counter ideas can have to be dealt with and have to be reckoned with and reconciled with. Um, but mostly it's that change of perspective and relationship with the wild. The wild isn't something out there, it's something here and now, wherever you are, even if you're in an urban environment. And seeing that and seeing the wild, even in your urban environment, is really important. It's easy to do so if you are literally in a forest and you're like, okay, this is an amazing forest. But when you're in a city, the wild is there. You just have to look for it. And like our collaboration with the various entities and groups that we work with, collaboration and cooperation are essential. And a lot of our relationships with these various collaborating groups, they're not transactional in terms of us paying them or them paying us. No, we each put in our resources on our land to do the projects that we want to do. And and again, identifying the wild in our communities, I can't stress enough how important that is, um, because it changes everything. It changes how you view yourself. And again, maybe I'm sort of preaching to the choir here. Maybe a lot of you do that already, and that's great. And sharing that with others is really important. And of course, I am going to say that anti-speciesist veganism is essential. We got here because of choices that we've made, and we've got to make different choices. Um, these are the links you can email me, you can find me online. Birchfield website is there. You can find my book wherever you find books and ask your library to carry it. And I welcome and very much look forward to your questions and discussion. And again, thank you so much to the Arihanta Institute for inviting me.
Well, thank you so much, Amelia. That was such a great topic and tour of what's going on in your region of the world. And I think sometimes it's wonderful for us to just get kind of a snapshot of not only what is happening, but what individuals can do if they're so inclined to kind of pursue this intervention, maybe among other interventions, but something also that I mean, I'm not going to take up too much time, but I find that so much advocacy tends to be um, taxing on individuals. So what kind of
Mm,
advocacy and interventions can you do that are nourishing, right?
hmm
That are building. And I think that lends itself to a more durable kind of existence in the field.
yeah.
So with that in mind, I'm going to pivot to a couple questions. We have a couple questions of my own. The first question here is from Chris Miller, who asks, or first says, thank you for this wonderful presentation on rewilding. Are there legal and political challenges specific to each nation state and specific locality? I'm sure, I don't know if we can ask you to each nation state what those are, but maybe specific localities where rewilding projects might want to get underway. And if so, can you tell us how you have navigated them and how others might want to do so in their own localities?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes to all of that. There's all sorts of legal issues from um, where the location is. I mean, we're in a rural place, and planting trees in a rural place isn't a big deal. Translocating ants is not a big deal because no one cares. They're like, oh, whatever, ants. But if, say, we wanted to translocate wolves or reintroduce wolves into Scotland, people you would have to go through a very specific process for all of that. So for us, one of the things, the way we've navigated certain things, for example, if we had taken some grants from the Scottish government, we would be we would have certain obligations to the Scottish government, including killing deer. So we chose not to. And we chose not to so that we can figure things out in a different way and we can learn to coexist with them in a different way. Um, then you have uh, generally the trigger points for uh, uh, the heavy duty legal stuff does come with reintroducing animals who have been exterminated from a place. Britain, I should have said in terms of when I was talking about the deer, Britain used to have wolves and bears and lynx. All those animals were present. Now there's a push to reintroduce lynx as a predator control, quote unquote, into the natural space. And there's a whole process to do that. Beavers has also been a legal flashpoint because some farmers are like, no, they're going to flood our land, but and they because they had been exterminated from Britain as well. Now they've been reintroduced, and there were a variety of legal challenges. So each place is different, but I can tell you that the flashpoint will always be around animals,
Mm.
always.
Well, thank you. At least getting people a little bit informed about what they can expect and
Yeah.
if they go down that route. So here's another question from Agni Hogabun, who asks, you define rewilding as an active science-based process to restore natural processes and agency. When it comes to natural, are there any flora and fauna in Birchfield that are determined as invasive and therefore not encouraged or destroyed? Who determines what is invasive to an area and what is the criteria? Here in the US,
Yes.
invasive species eradication is a big part of land management.
Yeah, exactly. Um, it depends on when you want to start history. Um, there are conscious decisions that have to be made, both in terms of what you're going to rewild back to, because you're not going to rewild back to some prehistoric era, right? So, uh, but that would be, I mean, that was working then, right? So you do have to pick that. There are the entirety of the Sitka spruce on site, for example. They're all from they're all introduced species, but that's the species of trees that are part of the commercial of the commercial realm of timber sales in Scotland. And so who determines it? It's generally there's a mix, both from a legal framework standpoint and there's also from the project standpoint. So for us, we are going to cut a lot of the Sitka spruce, and we have cut sections. But also, we are going to let a lot of it just stay. And there's a lot of it that's going to regenerate because that's part of the land itself. So this idea of what's natural, what's native, what's invasive, it's artificial. And so you just have to figure out, well, what mix of everything that we have can we not just live with, but everything and everyone can coexist with. Because if you have too much of the Sitka spruce, right, then you just don't have enough of the other trees that can and should be there. So again, there's always these different mixes of of places and people that are dictating these parameters, but they are artificial.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic too, right? Because we always say like, well, things are growing great for the invasive species, right? Like to
Yeah,
the catfish that are in a certain pond, like they're actually flourishing, right? And
exactly.
then we're trying to kind of conjure up what is in many ways ecosystemic stability, but that's very on a short schedule. In some long range, actually, that it could be affording, I don't know, some other kind of stability that is very beneficial, say, to catfish or some other species. And so I find it to be fascinating because there's also, when we look into human issues, right, indigenous issues, native issues, it becomes very interesting as well because if we're not careful, we start to slip into the language of kind of ownership, private
Hmm.
property, who was here first language, and I think
Hmm.
that's not an indigenous category when it comes to
Exactly.
humans, and I think we might be smart to um, lend that to when we're talking about non-human individuals, whether we're talking about animals or plants as well, where it's not just like you were here first, so you have a right to be here, but mostly what affords the greatest flourishing for everyone, what lends itself to the best consequences for everyone. Right.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. And it, the term, I don't like the term invasive. I mean, the deer who have been there since the Normans, since the 11th century, they're not invasive there. Like,
Yeah.
come on, they've
Yeah.
lived for centuries. Come on, you
No,
know?
no, exactly. I mean, it becomes tricky because then it's like how many centuries makes a native, right? And we don't, that's a conversation we don't
Yeah,
want to get into,
yeah,
but they've also
exactly.
established
No,
themselves and they're living there. How do we take their needs? And they're not going anywhere
they're not going anywhere.
anytime
We need to
soon.
coexist. We
Yeah,
need to figure out. What I'm really heartened by is that these conversations are happening in the rewilding spaces and in conservation spaces.
that's
They
good.
are not conversations that are left field wingnut. They're not. So, which really heartens me.
Okay, so relatedly, Wendy McGovern asks, how do you navigate situations where some of our fellow animals' needs clash with others? And do you have any examples?
Fortunately, I don't have any unpleasant examples
Hmm.
in terms of having to pit one animal against another one. I haven't had to, haven't dealt with that. Um, I with the deer who were trapped in that 50-acre area, one of the things that we did was actually lower the fences so they could start moving backwards and forward and not to decrease the browsing pressure on the area. And in some way, I felt bad because some of them had been born there. They didn't know any other spaces. They didn't know the outside wilderness. They just knew their area. So I felt bad in opening that up. But I also said, well, they shouldn't be trapped in here. And 50 acres is a lot, so it was not like they were trapped in a negative sense. Um, but letting them go is the right thing to do. They should be free to roam wherever they want, and there is the space for them to do that. There is extensive wilderness for them to run around in and thrive. And also with the ants, there was having to think about how we were going to look after them and get some people up into Birchfield when we weren't there, and then into the winter. I mean, things like that. Thankfully, I have not, and I hope I never have to, have never had to deal um, with serious sort of life and death matters with respect to animals.
All right. And I mean, this is also it's a question that's a real question, but also sometimes we hear these questions as these like first questions. Like, what do you do if you have this interest in conflict with
Hmm.
this interest in it? I always say ideally we don't. We do our best to minimize conflict and reconcile, but there I think the
I
attendee
think,
when Wendy asked an interesting question because there are some times when
yeah,
you really are dealing with it and sadly you have to
yeah.
make hard
And you
decisions.
have to make exactly. But I think well, I think all these questions have been great so far. But Wendy's question is valid because one of I did ask myself that. I said, well, if it comes to it and the deer have to be killed, I don't want to be involved anymore. That was my gut reaction. But then
Hmm.
I said, and I spoke to a few friends, and then I said to myself, you know what? No, if what you're going to do whatever you can so it doesn't come to that. But if it has to come to that, someone needs to be there and it's got to be you who's going to be thinking about this. So either to take responsibility, or to acknowledge the ethical disaster, and you don't just get to. And I said to myself, you don't just get to walk away. So I've sort of prepped my mind if it has to come to that, which it hasn't and it won't. But at that point, this was like pre-tree co, pre lots of things that we've done, where people are like, well, we're going to have to manage deer. We're going to
Mm.
manage. And so that was, I'm going to show up. I'm not running away from it. I'm not going to be like, oh, I'm not involved.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I'll pivot to another question, but I think it raises an interesting point. I sometimes think that, in a world that's messy, keeping our hands clean probably isn't the right decision most of the time, keeping our hands perfectly clean.
yeah.
Um, so here's a question from Diana Hewlett, who speaks to another project going on in Colorado, and it says another Colorado related effort is our very tense wolf reintroduction program, where gray wolves were brought from Oregon and BC and are facing a lot of pushback from the ranching community where the animals struggled to find territory on a changing landscape. There are many non-lethal solutions, but the narrative of vilifying wolves is strong because of livestock predation, and several individual wolves have been killed. When certain groups have unmovable ideologies, how do you suggest meeting these conversations?
You just keep having the uncomfortable conversations. And I say that as somebody who has done that. So a few years ago, I was invited to speak on a panel in a forestry panel, and um, I was specifically asked to bring up the point about animals, so and about deer and about not hunting. Um, and I was in a very non-friendly environment, right? What I thought was a very non-friendly environment because it was a forestry group. Let's just call it that, and where the killing of deer is normal. And I brought up the point about we've got 2 million deer and we've got 31 million sheep. We're only talking about the deer. We need to have a grown-up conversation if we're going to have any kind of forests in Scotland, and we need to talk about the 31 million sheep. And you know what? I was so incredibly nervous about that. I was so scared. But it resonated with a lot of
Mm.
people. I mean, people were clapping, and I got a standing ovation from a whole section of people. And even the folks who were looked like the most traditional and all of that, they were like, yeah, that's actually a good point. And a lot of times you will be saying something that will resonate with people, and that's what you have to find.
Mm.
And if it doesn't resonate with them, well, it doesn't resonate with them, but it doesn't change the facts. Um, you just have to keep going, and you have to find those people who are with whom your message is going to resonate. It's frustrating and it's scary, but it has to be done. And the thing is, for me, I really do think that you will always find somebody who is going with whom you're going to resonate.
Mm. And it also seems that sometimes you're the change is a few steps away. You're actually speaking to someone who's in a community who's like a younger person who it resonates with, and then they start in their next generation to bring it up. But it's some I always have found in advocacy of all forms is that trust is just so big, and people when you're on other sides of an ideology just inherently don't trust you for whatever reason.
Yeah, for
And then
whatever
and then
reason.
and it might take exactly that one person who happens to be there that day that takes it home to their community. But like you
Yeah,
said, I think you just have to do the work regardless.
you just have to do the work regardless. And the thing is, people are scared. Were scared at the time to say things like this. Now they are less so.
Mm,
Now that conversation has changed, and I would have, almost 10 years ago, I wouldn't have predicted that. Uh, so if you're saying something and you break through that fear barrier, there will be other people who will say that too.
no, it's true. Um, we say that a lot, and really anything in the,
Totally.
at a lot of right now in the United States, when you're talking about police or ICE protests, it's like the first person that gets involved is the one that actually gets other people to start getting involved. But the thing is, you have to be ready to be that first person because
Yeah.
there might be no first people there other than you that day, right? So. Anyway, so let
Well,
me let,
yes.
let me let me get back to these questions here. So Kim
Yeah.
Stallwood is here and is asked, have you had hunters come onto your property and shoot deer? If so, how have you dealt with them?
That's also another excellent question. So in Scotland, one of the things that's really good is you cannot extract anything from someone's property without written approval from the landowner. So thankfully, I have not had to deal with that because nobody has requested that. And nobody, I mean, people now know us, people know the project, so they would never be requesting that from us. So again, in that respect, I've been lucky. And if they were to request that, I know in the US, it's a little bit different, and so you have access to some spaces and all sorts of things. It's a little bit different, and every state is different. But permission is often required, and people just can't come onto your land and start killing or fishing and stuff
Hmm.
like that. So in that way, it's I've been fortunate as well. And I would just simply say no. I mean, that would just be it. If there were any kind of somebody to do that illegally, then we would have to deal with that.
All right. So here's another question from Agni. I'm gonna like paraphrase a little bit, but it's basically
Yeah.
saying that they've noticed that in recent years there's been maybe virtually no predators uh, in the UK. And so I think the question at the end is kind of asking like, how has this changed views about predation and wildness in the UK from your just perspective, even anecdotal? So it says, can you make remarks on the attitude of human British residents towards predators and wildness? Is Gen Z seemingly more interested in wildness? Um, is this valued, or is there another way people conceptualize non-agricultural, non-human dwelling space? Obviously, this is a very subjective question, but I'd love your insights.
Another great question. Um, I'll tell you about a very fancy pants university department came to visit Birchfield. Very fancy university, really engaged people with this like very intense topic. And they came to Birchfield. I was showing them around, telling them all sorts of things. And I came to the part where I said, yeah, Britain had bears and wolves and lynx and all these different things. And the entire group, it was like 24, 25 of them. It was a lot of people, smart people. They looked and young. They looked at me like they were like, "What? What are you talking about? What do you mean we had bears and wolves?" And I'm like, "Yeah, they were all exterminated so that they wouldn't eat the sheep and the cows and everything." They were like, "What are you talking about?" So they don't know. They don't know. This is even really engaged people with educations, da da da. They just didn't know. So there's an issue there about education. There's also the shifting baseline, which is we see normal and wild as to what it is now. We don't think back about what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and so forth. So, and every new generation has a different baseline as to what they consider normal. So you have that. Um, the topic of rewilding and I'm excluding what the media says about it because media is whatever. Um, but there is a great interest in it. There is a great interest from all age groups. And I know this also from the work that Lifescape Project has done with respect to lynx reintroduction, in talking to communities and fielding questions and surveys and data from the community, from a variety of communities, to understand whether they would be keen on such a thing. And the answer was very much yes. People of a variety of ages and a variety of places are interested in wilderness. They are interested in sort of recapturing something they didn't even realize we didn't have anymore.
Mhm.
So part of it is very much education and the engagement with the community to to have people understand um, what things used to be like. Because if they
Mm.
don't, if these university students didn't know, they should have known, you know? Like they should have known. They had plenty of time to. They should have known a lot of this stuff, and they didn't. And I have found that a lot. I mean, and even with respect to like students from Scottish schools that have come, they didn't know about the clearances and I'm like, what do you mean you don't know about the clearances? You're from. I'm not even from Scotland, and I know about the clearances. How do you not know about them? We never were taught that in school. What? So again, that the work is the continued engagement. It would be great to have education that actually centered uh, um, a variety of different things rather than one kind of agenda. But we don't have that, so
Mm.
we got to do the work.
Fair enough. Well, I think on that note, because you were mentioning a kind of group coming to your space, we have another question here. Um, I'm gonna say this is probably Monica Kinga or Kinga Monica. Sorry if I'm
Kinga,
not it's not saying it that way. Um, is who asks, first, it is highly admirable of what you're doing with respect to community engagement, the aforementioned community and NGO visits to your site. I have a twofold question. What benefits, if any, have these visits generated for your project? And secondly, did you have any interest or help from the private sector companies and individuals in order to further your project's goals?
So with respect to benefits from visits, material benefits, no. We don't really like, we don't charge an admission fee or anything like that. And I put in my time to show people around and things like that. So no. With respect to private sector, so we work with ACOM, which is a big, large, a very huge infrastructure company who has an interest in rewilding for a variety of their own reasons, and they like it and everything like that. They do they do a variety of projects on site. So they put in volunteering time, they put in the materials and so forth. Um, so the benefit to the site is there. So for example, the peat bog restoration, they took that on and they had volunteers and they bought the materials and they put stuff in and they worked on it and everything like that. And um, but otherwise, no, we haven't, other than our own funds, um, private funds from work, usual. We have not we've not asked for money from anybody else. So we just try to do things with whatever resources we have and whatever we can work together with our collaborators with. If that's something that we do in the future, I don't know. Maybe. I don't know if that answers the question, but basically that.
Yeah, no, I think so. And there's one kind of more logistical question
Hmm.
here. Paul asks, I understand Emilia will speak at, is it, how do you pronounce that? Fela, I don't know.
Fela.
Fela
Yeah,
Vegan
I think
at
it's
County
Fela.
Carlow, Ireland this coming August. Is that true?
Yes, that is true. That is totally true. I'll be there.
Okay.
And we can talk about rewilding then, and we can also talk about other stuff. I was planning on talking about other stuff, um, but still, I'll be there the whole weekend, so I'm happy to talk about anything.
Great. So we ran through those questions, and so I kind of left my own to the side until then. But I do have just a couple questions, and maybe these are bigger ones. Well, I think one question I think a question I have about rewilding in general. I mean, obviously everything you talk about fully like supportive. As I mentioned earlier, just the ability to encourage multi-species flourishing and community and collaboration. I don't know anyone who would be anyone sane who would be opposed to that. But when I think about other projects, like when I think about like food systems, for example, and then I think there's a new book coming out by Gabriel Rosenberg and Jan Dutkiewicz on like industrial food systems, which I haven't read much. But the idea, I think, from what I'm understanding, is like this kind of ratchet effect. Like what happens when we get to a place when there is no going back, right? We've reached a kind of population, we've reached a kind of certain kind of resource exhaustion where we're here with industrial food systems. It doesn't mean they have to be animal based or not, but we
Mm.
have to kind of let go of a mythic kind of future that we've made decisions that make impossible. And the reason that came to my mind is I think about rewilding too. It's that, how can we imagine? Do you think we can imagine rewilding given, say, not just current landscapes, but human populations or even certain non-human populations, right? The kind of
Mm.
industrialized animals. And I'm
Mm.
just kind of curious, do you see this as like a mass scale kind of global endeavor, or at this point, you're just trying to intervene in your local environment?
Probably a bit of both. But I certainly think I think there's a great question again. They've all been great questions. Um, imagining a different future is critical, because if we don't imagine something different, that will never be created. Um, I think that rewilding is actually essential to our survival, in a decent way of our species. We'll survive, but not in a very nice, livable space in a livable world. So I think it's actually essential, and it actually should be something that we do worldwide. Um, even with the issues of population and the issues of existing animals, again, because it takes a lot less space to grow food for humans than it
Mhm.
does to grow food for humans plus animals and the animals that we eat for food. Um, So I think it's a necessary exercise globally that to show that it actually can be done. It's really important, and it is also something that's very local, obviously, because it's where we are. Um, and I think it serves. I think it serves that part of your question where you talk about imagination. We have to imagine a different world. Um, if we don't, nothing will change,
Hmm.
irrespective of whether the politics are still set in the way that we have to do things the way they are now. I mean, I hearken back now to the first slide about
Hmm.
not setting your house on fire.
Hmm.
The biodiversity collapse is an existential issue for security nationally. The UK government has acknowledged it in this report that came out that was very curtailed from the actual other thing pieces that they didn't actually make public. So it is a recognition of biodiversity being essential and by saying that, then rewilding is the essential way that you're going to get biodiversity back up to a good way. So it operates in both ways. The project for me operates in both ways as something both local and global, as to paraphrase that saying.
No, I think that works for me. I mean, it's like, there's there's the part of me that obviously would loves to imagine this future and wants that future to happen, and I have no choice but to embody that and to practice that on a daily level. And then, right, then you get some statistics, and you're like, wait a minute, like how is it possible for this to, and maybe the possible is not any possible for another 100 years, 1,000 years, who really knows? But we
Exactly.
can't know that, so why not live it in a sane way and a kind of fulfilling way now? And so the reason, another example of that, because when I was thinking of, when I was listening to you speak, I live in Philadelphia in the US, in West Philadelphia. Like, there are not many. There are a little bit of spaces near us in a park like that, but I think, more in other contexts, and how, um, initiatives like micro sanctuaries or people taking in
Yeah.
animals that are not our typical animals is like a kind of more kind of, how would I say, small scale, maybe less time exhaustive, maybe less resource exhaustive intervention that individuals can make. And it's also something that people view that's happening not just locally, but like within your family life or your home life, but also has a relationship to a global horizon
Yes,
at the same
exactly.
time.
Exactly. And it is, yes, we need systemic solutions. We need systemic answers. But what happens if you don't get them? You have to push at some point. You have to push from wherever you are.
Yes.
You just have to.
Well, that's great. I think we can probably close on that, because I think that, that's what I noticed, and we I mentioned it earlier, from years of doing certain forms of advocacy, is so much of it is laden with kind of exhaustion and guilt and depletion and anger and sadness, that there are a lot of things, major kind of battles that will be lost. But if you're involved in something that you can slowly grow at home and provide nourishment and community and laughter and joy, then it's kind of food to keep you,
Yeah.
stable during those other times. So I really appreciate you highlighting the kind of importance of holding two at the same time.
Yeah. I completely agree. Um, and I also think a lot of times we get stuck in this very capitalist idea of success that we have to see results, but like the reality is that's not the way things work. So, you know, I've given up on that.
Yeah, no, no,
I
and
just I just do the thing.
and do things that you can get wins. We always say wins are important. Wins are important. Small wins. If you want to bring friends involved, if you want to get community involved,
Yeah.
nobody goes to their sports teams who lose all the time. I mean, sometimes they do, but it's really hard. But you just get a win here and there, and then
You're good. You're
we
good. Great.
get going. So, okay. So, in closing, I really just want to say thank you so much, Emilia, for joining us. I'm so happy that you were part of our series this year, and I just want to say so. First off, thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. The questions have been fantastic. I've loved everything.
Great. So I just want to let everybody know that we kind of pivot in a very different direction for our next talk on April 20th, where Bruce Friedrich from the Good Food Institute is going to talk about his new book. Um, the book's called Meat, but the talk is called Animal Free Meat, the Next Agricultural Revolution, which is in a very different direction. And I think that's really great here in our series. It's just the goal is to bring together a lot of different people working in different areas. Not everybody agrees, and that's fine too. But, in my mind, everyone is, as I kind of envisioned for the series, pointed to a horizon, and we're really just trying to figure out how we can navigate there. So I hope folks will join us for that talk next month. So lastly, again, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Emilia, for being here. And I hope to see you all in a month's time.